Hello, I'm MG and welcome to the part 8 of Azure MLOps video series. So previously we started to create our infrastructure as a code pipeline, and then we started to create our first continuous integration or CI pipeline that we were able to automate the process of uploading a data set, training a model, testing a model, downloading the artifacts, and we did everything all automated through our CI pipeline. And now this is the time that we can deploy the model to first staging and then production. So that is going to be our first continuous deployment or CD pipeline. If you want to know how we can do the CD pipeline now for staging and test the model in a staging environment, then let's see this video shortly.
Hello again everyone, this is MG and welcome to MLOps video series. So as you remember, if you have already watched previous videos, which I encourage you to do so before watching this video, we have already created our build pipeline. So we had a CI pipeline or continuous integration, and let's take a look at it quickly so we can remember exactly what we did. So I'm gonna edit the pipeline and show you here that we started to have the Python version inside the agent in my DevOps that is running this pipeline. Then I passed some unit tests, I saw the test result. Then I had a quick intro about what is CLI, what is Azure CLI. That's a way that I can code to interact with my resources that I have in my Azure subscription. And here the same thing for ML extension of this CLI. I need to install that in the agent first, and then I was checking if I have the workspace. We created a compute, we uploaded the data, trained the model, register, and then we got all those artifacts like models and some deployment requirements, the stuff that we need when we are going to deploy our model in a staging environment and production environment. So let's take a look to see what happens after running this pipeline in my Azure ML. So we saw that in the Azure ML, there's a new experiment created with the name we specified in our Azure DevOps pipeline when we were coding using ML CLI. And also if I go to the models, there's a new model already being registered for me, and actually it's ready to be deployed later on. So we have the model and everything already being logged for me. So let's get back to the DevOps, and now we are ready to release what we have created in a pipeline called CD or continuous deployment. Remember, we are all the time using continuous for both integration and deployment because we want to have all these processes automated and triggered based on what we configure. So let's start creating our first CD pipeline and deploying the model first in the staging and then in production. So let's deploy the model and create a pipeline for deploying the model in a staging environment. For doing so, I need to create a new release pipeline. So I click on release, I click on new pipeline, and I want to do again an empty job and define the task by myself. Awesome. So let's close this now, and I just want to open the task here. Before actually starting the task, let me show you something. So in the pipeline, the first thing is called artifacts. This is actually asking me that what are those artifacts and where they are, that I can grab them and release them to have your continuous deployment through this pipeline. So, and as you know, those artifacts are being created through my build pipeline that I had it here. So let me tell it that where are those artifacts. So they are in my build pipeline, and if I connect on source, I have my CI pipeline. This is the pipeline that trained my model. So my artifacts are coming from there, and I need to define that here. And the rest is all good. So let's click on add. You can see it's already being added here, and then let's start the tasks. Okay, the first thing, let me change it to something more clear to understand. We're gonna call it okay, let me just type down the name. We're gonna call it deploy to staging first and then production. All right, let me save it for now. And let's start to create our first task. So what's gonna be the first task here? Actually, before starting the task, let me make sure, we haven't selected the agent first. So again, the same thing as we did. I wanna run on Ubuntu machine and the rest should be fine. Okay, click on save. You do not have to save all the time. You can do it when you're done, but just in case I'm adding the save. And then we can start the first task. As you can probably guess, the first task that we need to do, like the build pipeline we did, if you remember, that was the specifying the Python version, which was 3.6. So let me again change it here. I want to do 3.6. Awesome. So for the next task, let me click on plus sign. And what we're going to do for the next task, we are going to again add that ML extension to make sure my agent can interact with my Azure machine learning using CLI. So I'm gonna call again Azure CLI. These steps should be already familiar for you. I click on CLI and change it to, let's say, add ML extension. Oops. Capital. And the same thing here, we need to have a connection to make that pipeline being executed. And again, for writing down our code, we have two options. First, we can just write down the code as is here as an inline option, or I can make it through a script file if I have through a path in my repo. But for now, let's say I want to do it here because it's going to be fairly simple. I just want to install the extension, and you should already know that we tried this command in Cloud Shell, and we saw how we installed the ML extension on Azure. Okay, so the rest should be fine, and you can go to the next task. So for the next task, what we're gonna do, we are going to deploy our model in a staging environment. And what has been recommended, again, based on your requirement, there are so many other ways that we can configure the MLOps pipeline and define different environment for our staging and production. But what I'm gonna do for now, I would love to deploy my model in container as a place that I can put the model there and let it work. And then I will do prediction based on a model that is deployed in container instance to see if the model is performing based on what I expected. Okay, and then when we are happy with that staging configurations and the way that my model is performing there, then I can deploy that model to production. And in production, I will use Azure Kubernetes. So for now, Azure Container Instance is a service that I'm going to use to deploy my model and then test and see my staging test. If I'm happy, then I will deploy to production. So what is the next one? The next task would be, again, another Azure CLI, and I'm gonna deploy that to container. So let me rename it to deploy to Azure Container Instance. And then the same service connection here. And for the code part, again, this is a kind of inline, and I'll explain what is the code. So let me copy that and paste it here. So as you can see, this is pretty popular. I'm using that ML extension of Azure CLI to deploy the model inside the same variables that we were defining in the build pipeline, if you remember. And then using that metadata and model stuff that we had in the landing part, and also some deployment configurations. Let's take a quick look on what are those configurations. So if you go to the deployment folder inside the Git files, you can see that for staging and production separately, I have different YAML files that define the configurations of those services that I want to deploy in my model. Let's say for configuration of staging environment, it is just telling me this is the amount of the gigabyte of memory, number of CPU that I want to have in my Azure container instance. Fairly simple, but you can have more complicated configurations and management here. The same thing for the Kubernetes, but there are some more configurations needed for that. We're gonna come back to it later when we deploy the model in production. And also for inferencing, I have some secondary information about telling me that what is that score file that is going to do the prediction when we push the model to staging or production, and what are the configuration YAML files. And if I show you the score.py, you will see that this is the way that I am doing the prediction. So this code will be executed to my container instance when I deploy. And I have mainly two functions. The first one will upload my model, and as you can see through the path, and make that as a global parameter here. And then it will print the time, but this can be totally optional. And then when I have the model ready, the run function will actually do the prediction. So we get the data from the API call that someone is calling that service, and we do the prediction and put it as a JSON file and dump it back as a result to the person or whoever or the application that requested to see the prediction results. So that's all about what we are doing here and why we are using these files. They are certainly necessary when we are going to deploy, and you can have them all in your Azure Machine Learning Studio, or you can manually create them, have your YAML files, and as for example the data scientist did here, they had it in their GitHub, for example, and they did a pull request, push everything to Git or to our repo. And again, we have all the same files that I'm showing the Git here as well. And this is just what we discussed. Awesome. So let's get back to the pipeline, and we are ready to go to the next task. Let me click on plus. So now we have deployed the model, let's say inside my Azure container instance. Oh, again, I forgot. So before going to the next task, let me show you something. We had some variables that we haven't defined them yet because that's a new pipeline. So let me go to variables here. And we have done that before, so it shouldn't be a new thing for you. But again, I'm gonna click on add, and I have my variable name, so I just gonna copy them. So the first thing is service name staging. That's gonna be the service name that I'm gonna deploy my model inside my staging environment, and we will see this variable value when you're done with deploying into a staging. And the name, I'm choosing the project name. You can basically choose whatever you want based on your project or organization naming convention. The second variable is my resource group. That's the place that I have my AML there. So the name would be MLOps WSH or workshop, and resource group RG1. And the last one, as you know, it's the name of the workspace, my actually Azure Machine Learning workspace. So I add it here, and then the name is MLOps Workshop AML or Azure Machine Learning 1. Awesome. So we have added the variables that we need when we were in the pipeline. Let me get back to the task. So we added all these variables. The other thing, remember that we created a landing folder as an staging kind of directory of our build pipeline to dump those models and stuff there and grab it from there to deploy. So the same thing that we have here. So we are using that landing kind of folder to do this deployment. So we have to specify that landing folder inside my working directory. So let me click on three dots. And as you can see, my build pipeline and the folder of that build pipeline is already being added here. Why? Because in the pipeline here, we have added that artifact as a source for my release pipeline. So let's get back here again, click on three dots, and I want to select this landing folder as the working directory for my deployment, and I have everything being added here. So I click on OK. Alright, so let's save the pipeline and actually execute this pipeline and see how that release pipeline gonna work. We're gonna see how it's gonna deploy my model to an Azure container instance and see what's gonna happen to this Azure machine learning workspace when we are doing that using all code and CLI. So let's create a new release and we're gonna deploy to staging. This is gonna be our artifact, so we're good to go to click on create. So there's a new release created. I'm gonna click and we should be able to see that it is queued and it should be running soon. So I'm gonna pause here the recording maybe, and as soon as the execution is done, I'm gonna show you the results and we're gonna discuss from there. Alright, so the pipeline failed at the beginning and because of a very simple mistake, and I fixed it and it worked. But before showing that how it is already deployed in a container, let me show you first what I changed and how I fixed that error message. So we're gonna edit the pipeline, edit the release. Okay, discard. Can edit. Okay, I'm not in the release yet, so I have to go to the pipeline first. That was actually run history, and from here I can edit. And then I'm gonna go to the tasks, and here as you can see, I didn't change. I changed one thing in the code. First I had just two underscores, one underscore, I changed it to 2. And the other thing is, as you can see, I am using these files for my configuration and inferencing for the deployment. But when I was defining my working directory, I just chose landing, but actually these files are inside landing and deployment folder, which is here. So instead of choosing landing, I chose deployment, and then I clicked on OK. So the deployment came here and it was able to find where are these files inside this folder. So that's it. I clicked on create release, and if we go to see what happened, and as you can see, it failed for a couple of times, and then I was able to successfully run, and let's see what happens. So deployment successful, and let's see the logs. So I was able to pass all those tasks we defined in the pipeline, and lastly we deployed the model to a container instance. And if I scroll down, there should be a URL. Yes, this is my scoring URI. This is actually the URI that I need to call and actually do the prediction and return the results. So if I copy this URI and just paste it in my browser, hit enter, you can see this streaming data. Well, that's pretty straightforward because we haven't provided any data. We are just calling this service to do prediction without putting any data. So it is expecting us to give a data there. So that was about deploying the model to the container, which we successfully did. And let's get back to our Azure Machine Learning Studio to see what has happened here. So if we go to the models, you remember that we already registered a model called insurance. But if I go to endpoint, which is a place that lists the deployments that I have, it was empty before, but as you can see now, we have a new service, a new endpoint created with this name. And where this name coming from? Well, we define that in our release pipeline. Let me show you again. So if I go to the pipeline, so to the release, and then edit the pipeline, tasks. So remember when we were deploying, we defined a service name, and that service name is coming from the variables here. And this is the same name that I can see here as well. And if I click on that, it is showing me the same REST endpoint that I can use or copy to do prediction. The nice thing here is that if I go to consume, it will show me the test code that I can use to do the prediction in 3 different languages for scoring. And it can actually speed your process when you want to do a quick test on how that URI and REST endpoint is working. Awesome. So we were able to successfully deploy that model in a container instance, and now we are in our staging environment that we can see and test how the model is performing before moving to production. So if you remember, when we were in the pipeline, we assigned a kind of trigger. So trigger can be assigned in different ways. For example, when I am deploying the model to staging, so I can schedule it based on a certain schedule that I want, days and hours. But here what we are doing, we are triggering this deployment as soon as my data scientist has pushed something to the repo, right? So when we are developing a new code, a new algorithm, so the data scientist will move that, do a pull request, and it will be moved to a master branch. And then my build pipeline will start to train that model and do testings, all unit tests we define. And here I will have a new artifact, which is a new model that has been trained based on that new code. So it will automatically trigger the staging to do deployment to staging, and then we're gonna see how the model is performing there. So let's get back to our deployment and start to test. So we have deployed the container instance, but again, before moving to production, we want to test how the model is performing. So for testing, we need to have some Python packages already installed in this agent to be able to run and test, right? And we did it before. So if you remember, we had a bash command here. So let's search bash and I click on add, and let's rename it as again install requirements. Okay. And the script path. So I already have the script. I do not need to have it in line, which you can, but here it would be fairly simple because I have all the packages in the text file. So I click on the landing part that I have, and that's why we copied this information so I can use it when I am deploying the model and testing that. The package requirement, and this is the bash command that I have here. All right, so we have defined the path. But before, the same mistake we did, so we have to come to control options. Actually, I think it should be in advanced. Let me close this. Yes, the working directory is here in advanced part. Click on three dots, and we need to define our working directory that to run this .sh file, and it should be my package requirement. I click on OK. And we are good to go for the next step. So I click on add a new task, and now this is the time that I want to test my staging environment and the model that I have in that container. So what I'm gonna do here, I want to add a new Azure CLI task. I click on add here, and I will rename it as my staging test. And the same thing for the service connection that we created to our Azure subscription. And the script type, it's gonna be shell. And the script location, well, I wanna make it actually inline, so I wanna write down the code here. And I have the code ready, so let me just copy that and paste it here. So what this code is doing, you already know PyTest. We use it to path our unit tests based on the test.py that we had. And now we have a different file, which is a file that's gonna test my staging environment. And then again, the same thing, we are publishing those test results in the dashboard that we have in the build pipeline and the release pipeline also in Azure DevOps. We did it before. And of course, for getting the testing part done for a model that is working now in our container for the staging environment, they need a URI. Remember, we had it already here, this REST endpoint, so we have to pass it somehow to this command line here. And we're gonna automate this process. So we're gonna deploy all the time. This pipeline will be automatically running, and we will have different score URL when we are running this pipeline. So it should be coded, not hard coded. And let's see what exactly we are doing to actually get that score URL. But before showing that, let me finalize this part. So this file is coming within a folder. So we have to define a working directory here. I click on it. And we are in landing. And this file, the .py file that I am doing is inside the test. I think, let me check. Yes, the staging test is already here. So I click on integration, that's my working directory, click on OK, and inside this working directory, that file gonna be there. Let's actually check out quickly what does that staging test doing to test my model that is running in a container. So let me open the repo, and my file should be also here as well. I click on test, staging test, and see I have a different code for testing my model in production. So what I'm doing here, I am making a sample. These are all the features that I use to train my model. So the same thing. And then I put it in a test sample, and I will run, and we call that kind of model a score URL through this given input for the function. I test it, and using assert, I'll check, for example, make sure the response is not none, the application code is okay, and the length, and also the header of the response. So basically I am doing this logic to make sure my URI is not none, and also the outcome of that prediction is not none, and it is giving me what I'm expecting as a prediction. And I'll come back to how we are testing the production, which would be a similar concept. But at least for now, we know what this staging test doing and what we are expecting. Oh, sorry, I changed the code. And let's see how we are getting that URL of that staging model that is running on container. And this is the code is doing that. So AZML service show, my resource group name. These are the variables we defined them before. Workspace name, staging name. And then we do the query and we get the response back. Let's do it actually quickly to show you. So again, I'm coming to my Cloud Shell. Let me copy and paste the same code that we have in Azure DevOps to just show you what we are doing exactly. So again, I'm using the same command line that we have in our DevOps pipeline, and I'm just putting the variable values inside, and the same workspace name, the same machine learning workspace and resource group name, and this is the name of my deployment. So let's run it. Awesome. As you can see, it is returning some information about insurance ACI deployment that we had as a service, and the scoring URI is already here. But I do not need to have all this information. So what I need, actually might make it longer. What I need is actually just the URI, and that's it. So that's why I have added some more text here to actually just return the score UI. So let's just test it. Let me get back. I'm gonna paste the code here, and as you can see, it is showing me. Let me make it expanded again. The service show using the same variables, but now this time I just want to have the scoring URI. Let me hit enter, and it is just returning my URI, the same thing that I want here. So now I have a command line that purely retrieving that scoring URI that I can try to run my staging test through that URI and see what's gonna be the prediction results to make sure my model is working properly. So now when I'm doing the testing, this is the time that I'm gonna publish the test results. So click on task. I want to create a new task here, and remember we did before, we want to publish the test results. That's already here. I click on add. So publish test results. I don't want it here. And the only thing is, because I'm publishing everything inside test, I use the capital letters. I just changed this. And let me change it to something better, probably publish staging test results, to make sure this is different than the unit test we had before. And awesome. So let me save before I finalize changes. All right. So before going further, let's create the release, test everything to make sure the pipeline is working, and also how that staging test gonna work to test the model that I have deployed in a container as my staging solution before going to production. So let's create a release. I click on create, and again, it's gonna take a little bit of time to finalize that deployment and then do the testing. So I'll pause recording and resume as soon as this part is done. All right, so it just finished actually my deploy to staging pipeline, and let's see what has happening here. And as you can see, 100% of my test that I was testing my model in staging in a container has passed successfully. So let me click on logs, and you already saw that how we deployed the model in an ACI, and we saw that there's a URI that can give me back the prediction if I call it. And that was a place that I was testing the model that is deployed in the staging environment, and the test was successfully passed. And if I see the published test results part, there's a URL telling me that this is a dashboard that the test results is there, because we used the published test result as a task in my pipeline. And if I click on here, you will see a kind of visualized dashboard that shows me how was the performance of my unit test, and it was 100% successful. Awesome. So now let's actually manually test my model in staging using that URI in a code to see how it's gonna give me the prediction of whether someone in that as an insurance policy holder will claim a file or not. Remember, that was a classification model that we were training. So let's get back to my Azure ML. This is my Azure machine learning environment, and if I go to endpoint, you can see that there's an endpoint created in an ACI, and we created using Azure DevOps pipeline. Remember, I showed you when you want to consume, there's actually a sample code for you. So I want to choose Python, and the URI and everything, all the information is already here. So what I'm gonna do, I just Control A, Control C, I copy that, and let's paste it in a notebook to try how it's gonna work and how it will return my results back as a prediction. So let me create a new file. Let me call it staging test, and I'm gonna click on create, and my computer is running. And here I can just paste the code. This is just a command, let me remove. And now for the data, I need to put a sample data as an input of my machine learning model, and call this URL, which is a model that's deployed in my container, and predict and print the results of that predicted value. So I already have a sample data set as an input for my machine learning model, just one row. And let me copy and paste it here. That's a pretty long one because we have so many inputs and features. And let me execute and see what's gonna happen. Awesome. You can see that the result just got back, and these are the probability that I can expect from having yes or no. So I got the probability of the prediction as a result back, and we almost did something similar when we were testing in my release pipeline, and then testing the final outcome to make sure there is no non-value there. And that's how we ended up having that successful test results published in the dashboard we just visualized. Awesome. So for now, what we did, we were able to actually create our first release pipeline that will grab the artifacts we created from the release pipeline, as you can see here, and we had the model, the deployment configurations, everything there. And as soon as there's a new artifact, it's gonna trigger a pipeline, the stage that actually going to deploy that to staging. So we tested the staging, and as soon as this pipeline worked successfully, which means that we have passed the test and the model is performing well in staging, that's the time now we can push that solution, because you're tested, you're happy, to production, another task for our MLOps journey. So we're gonna do this in the next video, then stay tuned, we're gonna go through that in the next video. Thank you.
Awesome. We just deployed our first model in a staging environment. We saw that how we can test the model in staging, and let's assume that we were almost happy with the results that we got in a staging environment, and that was a great choice to move it in production. So let's see now how we can have our release pipeline now. This time, instead of staging, we're going to do something similar, but this time for just production, and see the final results and how the model gonna perform in production environment. So if you want to see that part, stay tuned, and we're gonna see each other in the number 9 video shortly.